our lovely progress bar to fill up. And then I'm gonna pause for 10 seconds to make sure there's no echoing noise, but let us know what year you want to travel to, future or past, and maybe why. Or if there's like a famous person or in the past that you want to talk to, or just like have boba tea with, just let us know in the chat.
Will it even be called boba tea in the future?
Yeah, I wonder. What do y'all think boba tea is going to be called in the future? Let us know in the chat. Anyways, we'll officially get started. Thank you all so much to coming to Defining Inclusive Culture in Design with Design Buddies and ADP List. This event will be hosted by our lovely mentors, Natasha and Bhavna. And I'm Grace. I founded Design Buddies, the largest design community in the world. We have very fun events like this to talk about very wholesome topics. And you're all welcome to join us on Discord. And we have just fun stuff, and our mascot is Fluffle, our bunny. So there's that. And I'll hand it over to Winona to introduce ADP List.
Thank you, Grace. Hey, everyone. My name is Winona, and I'm the Community and Partnership Manager at ADP List. And for those of you who haven't heard about ADP List, we're a global community based on making genuine connections. We're a platform where people can find, book, and meet mentors around the world. And we're on a mission to democratize mentorship for every corner of the world. So if you haven't had a chance to give us a try, head over to adplist.org to get started and meet some mentors. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Grace.
Awesome, thank you. And for this event, feel free to connect with both Design Buddies, ADP List, all of our speakers, we'll have all the links dropped as they introduce themselves. And also share your takeaways. If you learned something profound or just really or something that any of our speakers mentioned that really resonated with you, we'd really appreciate it if you share on social media, particularly LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, tag all of our speakers, tag Design Buddies and ADP List. We would love to comment on it, reshare, and retweet as well. And with that, and we'll also have a networking sheet where you can connect with all your fellow buddies and amazing designers, and a group photo and a wave towards the end. So make sure to stay with that. And with that, I'll hand it over to Bhavna for intros.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we're really excited to have all of you here today, and we're looking to focus on creating inclusive culture. This particular moment is unparalleled. There have never been so many people in the exact same situation due to COVID when it comes to their careers, and really considering what their opportunities are and what values they want to see in their workplace. One thing that we've seen happen in the past year and a half, if you can believe it's been a year and a half, is really focusing on inclusivity, making sure that we are supported in our workplaces, that we have flexibility, and that we're able to balance work and life while being included in the conversation. For example, I saw an amazing thing posted by one of our speakers earlier today, Anna, talking about the fact that we often talk about minorities or diversity in work, but the reality is that we are actually the majority. Diverse applicants, diverse employees make up the majority of employees. And so it's time for us to keep bringing the conversation forward about inclusivity. I'm going to go ahead and ask the speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll ask a few questions, get their feedback on what it's like to really create this culture at your own workplace. But before I do that, I'd love to tell you just a little bit about myself. I've been working in product management for about 10 years and management consulting for about 3.5 at McKinsey & Company. And in that time, I've led product for 4 startups, 3 of which have been acquired. And in each situation, I have seen that culture is what enables execution, and execution is what wins the day. So with all of that said, I would love to turn it over to Ying, see if we could get a quick intro, a little bit of background, and of course, remind everyone that everyone's full bios are also available, which I have to thank Grace and Winona for. So Ying, tell us a little bit about your current job, your passion, and what you look to do at work.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Ying. I'm a senior UX designer at Honeywell. I work on creating, building technology software. At my off hours, I'm the co-organizer of Ladies That UX Atlanta. We're an inclusive design community, as well as a design mentor for ADP List and Design Buddies. My passion is definitely a design community. I've never been more social than I've been in the past year, so it's been great to meet so many people coming from diverse backgrounds and perspectives and just learning from them. So that's definitely been my passion for the past year. As an introvert, it's a lot.
It's great to have you. And I'm glad you're seeing maybe increased ways to interact as an introvert. I certainly have.
Absolutely. Very creative outlets.
Yeah. Christine, if you could tell us a little bit about your job, your passion.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'm super excited to be here today. So my name is Christine Yoon. I am a design manager at LinkedIn, based in the Bay Area in San Francisco. So a little bit more about my interest and kind of background and why I'm here. I'm very passionate about diversity and inclusion. Like I've been working on creating something within the design organization and within my product team at LinkedIn to create more diverse and inclusive practices and creating awareness around diversity and inclusion. But I've always been passionate about this topic. When I was in college, I worked at the admissions office, helping recruit underrepresented minorities who are first generation college students. Also, I worked at Deloitte Consulting for a good 5 years and was very passionate there doing diversity recruiting to try to elevate students who would be interested in that field as well. So I bring a lot of those practices with me and hopefully can share some wisdom on everyone else today.
Fantastic. As a former ICASU, East Coast Asian American Student Union member, all about the campus activism. Anna, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Bhavna. My name is Anna. I'm a director of experience and product design at Vocabulary. I work as a consultant with different companies, usually startups. So I'm exposed to a lot of different environments, cultures, dynamics, all kinds of people, fabric, and interactions. I'm also the founder of Women in Design app, which is a global Slack community of women in design, where we basically empower and educate each other and elevate each other. Members range from graduates up to CDO level. It's basically an expertise sharing platform to make up for all the sort of blockers that we encounter throughout our career. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here, and thanks everyone who's joining in. It's really exciting.
Fantastic. Federico?
Hello everyone, Federico Francioni here. I'm a principal experience designer at Facebook, based in the Bay Area. Technically, right now I'm actually in Italy. That's where I'm from. So it's like 2 a.m. for me. So pardon if I'm a little bit slow than than the average. Well, one of my passion is definitely working about talking about and doing something about being more inclusive and making sure that we talk about the sense of belonging. One of the reasons is that I love unconventional things, especially in design. And I also have a kind of like unconventional sort of handicap because I'm half deaf. And it's something that people wouldn't notice, but it's something that affects the way I perceive reality. So I'm really passionate.
Okay.
Some of the elements that makes us different.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Federico. And last but certainly not least, my co-moderator and co-host, if you will, Natasha. Tell us a little bit about your passion and your work.
Hey everyone, I am a senior manager of product design at EA. So that's just a fancy title. That means I, oversee a team of designers and managers and a couple of product verticals. I'm super passionate about everything that everybody said, +1 to all of that, but particularly for mentoring and supporting women and underrepresented talents and designers. This is a passion project for me and Bhavna, and I am so happy and thankful that we found so many people who just me, I want to speak here and share more about inclusive and diversity and culture. So yeah, so thank you panelists for being here, and thank you everybody for tuning in. And I know some people actually dialed in from Europe and stuff. So thank you for being here.
That's right. We do have a very international crowd. And that is one of the wonderful things about Design Buddies and about ADP List. I feel like the community that's been created is just so fully intact, but also so fully wide and international. So as we dive into our questions here, one thing I want to note is that at least in North America, there has been a deep conversation ever since, last year and what we call BLM summer. This is certainly not the first death at the hands of police enforcement, but it was the one that created a cultural moment that allowed us to move the conversation just a little bit further. And what I'd love to do is share with you a few things that McKinsey has done over the past year to support diversity and inclusivity, but also invite our panelists to share a little bit about some of the things that have been happening in their organizations as well. So McKinsey, in the face of this past summer, has spent time creating 10 commitments, for example, which is really focused on increasing recruiting efforts, sponsorship inside of the organization so that people can find others who are further along in tenure to endorse and support their careers, a racial equity hackathon, increased support for women in terms of mat leave and reproductive health support, and also just increased transparency around the number of senior partners we have, for example, in the software practice, which is currently a goose egg, the number of partners that we have, which are coming up to 2-digit numbers, and we hope that they will someday be, in the higher 2 digits rather than the 10s, maybe the 30s or 50s. And also just this desire to continue to promote the conversation. I would love to turn it over to Natasha. Natasha, what has been happening at EA? What are some of the things that your organization has been doing to drive inclusivity and drive additional diversity in their workplace?
A ton, actually. But I think the most impactful one for me personally is when the news about George Floyd broke. What happened was that immediately, the executives created safe spaces and support for everyone who's affected. So we were able to talk about it, process about it, but obviously they prioritize our Black brothers and sisters. But that was my very, very first time experiencing that. And then that happened again when the Asian hate thing happened. So they very, very quickly just created tons of support spaces for us to just process it as a team, as a group, talk about it, and created a ton of mental health support around it. The other things that are coming up because of that are things like the creation of IND committee, which I'm a part of in a ton of the organizations, and also increased support for ERGs and IND leaders. We also have this thing called pandemic care leave for women and everybody to take advantage of, even if you have family or not. And other stuff like flexibility was number one. That was the mandate from top down for all of the managers. You got to be flexible, you got to be very supportive, and you got to try to create inclusion and diversity for everyone else. So that was and that kind of made me realize that there's so many things we could do to create this culture.
Great. And Christine, could you tell us a little bit about what LinkedIn has been doing for the past year and a half on this front?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I echo a lot of Natasha's sentiment. I'm really proud of the fact that when all of these things were happening, first with COVID, and then obviously all the injustices, social injustices that were happening around the African American community, the Black community, and the Asian American community, our leadership really stepped it up. And we had town halls as a company to actually talk about these. And then as managers, we were enabled with different capabilities to implement ways that we can have these inclusive discussions and safe spaces within our teams as well. On top of that, there were a lot of benefits that were provided too around flexible remote work. Everyone went remote. And then on top of that, at LinkedIn, we really value work-life balance. A lot of people were having mental health issues and burning out too. So they gave us an entire week off, the whole company in April as a spring break. We already get the whole week of 4th of July off and Christmas and New Year's. but they gave us a spring break this year. And then they just implemented half-day Fridays for all of July and August across the company, just to give people that time to recoup, to kind of think about all these different types of things that might be happening in their personal situations or externally. So there were a lot of these different types of practices that were implemented.
That's fantastic. And you're so right in kind of touching upon the fact that some of these things are really led by the needs of employees becoming more and more sharply visible, and maybe more collective in a certain way. So one of the things I'd love to ask next is, where have you seen the ability to influence culture inside of your organization? And what are some of these actions that you've taken? So if we could start with Federico, thinking about the past year and a half at Facebook, where you've been able to leverage a community of practice, where you've been able to take lessons learned, and what that's looked like for you.
Well, mostly it's about practicing what others teach, right? And it's mostly about leading by example. A lot of the time we hear a lot about the inclusion and diversity, but I think that the most important things to do is act and acting. Even during my short presentation and intro, I was saying I love to talk about inclusivity and everything else. I said, no, I don't love to talk. I love to do stuff, right? So that's important. And just to give a couple of examples, even in the work that we do at Facebook, and even when I was at Microsoft, but it's really important that in every day, whatever we consider as designers, we know the impact of the things that we do. And we know that every time we design for a purpose, and our purpose should be as global, as inclusive as we can. So when something that can be internal or external, just asking ourselves, am I really okay with doing something that is 80-20, right? So something that covers 80% of the population, or am I really taking the effort to go the extra mile and even experiment? What does it take to go 100%? Yeah. That's a subtle difference, but sometimes you just can take the risk and say that, maybe it doesn't take that much to get to 100%. So I would just invite everyone to just give it a try. Stop just talking and just give it a try.
Awesome. I love a bias towards action, iterative learning action, but always towards action. And Christine, building on that, my understanding is that you brought a whole honest to goodness strategy to your organization.
Yeah, definitely. So when I talked about how LinkedIn enabled teams and managers, being a manager in a big product area at LinkedIn, I was like, we have to do something. You can't always just talk, right? Because then people, it's good. It's good to create that awareness. I'm not discounting any of that, but people want to take action and do something. So what can we do? I basically got together with the product leaders, engineering leaders, and other cross-functional leaders in our product department, held a workshop with everyone to have a discussion around diversity inclusion. What does it mean? How do you feel? How do your teams feel? And basically use design thinking to curate a workshop to have this type of conversation. And through those outputs of what those potential opportunities were, I later had a smaller task force of somebody within product, somebody within engineering, marketing, myself and design. We came up with a strategy around how can we implement inclusive design practices, not as just managers in terms of the people that we're managing and the processes, but also in the products that we're creating at LinkedIn. And how can we be inclusive of different populations? How can we build things into our roadmap that can help elevate, these certain issues around diversity and inclusion, and have been working on that for the past year. And basically from that type of action, I've been able to scale it up to the design organization as well and bring in, different speakers to talk about various different topics. And more or less the framework that we came up with was just 3 simple steps. One is learn about the topic at hand. So create that level of awareness. Second thing is experience it. So if you don't come from that particular background or don't understand it, bring in somebody who can. It's almost like doing user research, right? Have a panel, have a discussion around it so you can understand the topic. And then the third thing is to do something. So to take action. So from those learnings, it's similar to how you build products, right? You kind of do your research, you kind of understand what the user's needs are, and then you go come up with ideas and do something. So that's where we did hackathons, certain different types of things, volunteer efforts to give back to those communities. And that's kind of the cycle and the framework that we're applying to the work that we're trying to do now across the product team that I'm working on.
That's fantastic. I mean, I think one of my favorite things about design thinking is that it's generative rather than deductive. You really get the ability to kind of bring in more ideas. And we did something very similar with our racial equity hackathon, where we actually gave the entire firm upwards of 10 hours of lecture information, so they could sit down and listen to economists who have truly studied the impact of systemic racism, for example, on your earnings ability or the housing crisis, et cetera. And I think that fact base is the biggest thing that we can all push for in our organizations, because so few people truly understand the situation on the ground, the lived experience that folks have. Thank you. And it's tough, right? It's so important for middle managers to drive change and to drive cultural, adaptation and like conversion into something that is more progressive. But it's tough for middle managers because you also still have to balance your own work life. So I'd love to ask Anna, especially as someone who is an entrepreneur, is running your own thing, consulting for multiple organizations, how do you balance your work and your life? What recommendations do you have for the rest of us?
I think the best analogy is to treat your career and your life goals as you would treat a product, as in an end-to-end product development journey. So, kind of making an assessment of what you want to accomplish or what you want to do or where you want to get to, and go through a process of not only personal discovery, but professional discovery, emotional discovery, and that could be through different jobs that you take, through different skill sets that you acquire. And then sort of define, you start, if you get to a place where you learn what you don't like and what doesn't work for you, you're going in the right direction, because as long as you're moving forward, even if you stumble, that's absolutely key. And then sort of kind of just defining, define a roadmap, define what are your epics, like the big areas of development or things that you want to accomplish, break that down into stories. What do stories mean? Define your ACs. What do you need to do in order to get or do something else? And I think if you break the macro, like the overall picture at micro level, into smaller steps, and if you're consistent throughout, that's how you go the distance. And it really works. I think the best thing about being a consultant is that you're always on the tip of your toes, and you always have to hit the ground running, and you have to be able to read people, environments, pick up workflows and processes. And I think, that kind of keeps you on edge in the best way possible. And also in terms of, people and managing teams, which I do sometimes in terms of building teams or help grow teams at startups. I think it's really important to always keep in mind that we're all people, we're all real, we all have our own personal experiences, realities, skill sets, difficulties, and it's just, if we treat each other as people, that just opens up the possibilities and sort of creates a psychological safety that allows us to be very brave and kind of, leap forward into the future and really good products and etc.
Fantastic. And Ying, what about, who we actually are outside of work?
Yeah, absolutely. This is kind of like a daily mantra for me, but I always try to ground myself in terms of separating myself from my work. And it's kind of hard because the design industry, you hear descriptors and values like, passion and driven and all that. And it kind of equates to like long hours and dedicating a lot of not only like mental, but emotional labor into it. So my takeaway from that is establishing those healthy boundaries for yourself. And it's different from everyone. Sometimes what you need is like a weekly or daily reminder to pause and to reflect and to say, like, how are you psychologically or emotionally impacted by this past week, and what are your current processes? How can you optimize on them? So I echo similar advice in terms of applying that iterative, product methodology to your own life, and also giving yourself that space to make mistakes, to action, to do something. And then sharing those boundaries with people that you interact with that are near and dear to your life, especially with the whole past year, our work and our personal lives have blurred so much. So it's kind of takes, I know it like takes that kind of additional initiative and that effort to establish those healthy boundaries.
I love that. I think it's true that the boundaries between work and life have blurred. You know, for many of us, it's kind of just roll out of bed and walk 2 feet to your desk. But it's also required all of us to draw boundaries and all of us to learn about the importance of them, because they suddenly cease to exist in a certain way. You know, and I love what you had to say about sort of keeping yourself separate, remembering that you are actually a person and also a person doing a job. I can tell you in the past, you know, I've had to pivot a couple of times when I've worked to implement change in an organization and it hasn't quite worked out. So for example, I worked for a startup that was very interested in having true product thinking, and they struggled to adopt any kind of agile or estimation. And as a result, you know, my pivot was really to identify what I believed their launch date to be and kindly walk on my own path and allow them to kind of pursue that. Anna, would you have any stories of times that you've tried to implement change at a client and maybe you had to pivot, change things a little bit?
You can always recommend and kind of point in the right direction, but people have to want to do that and also jump on board. And it's, no one changes if they don't want to change. So you have to think that the biggest challenge is always to share what the value is in a certain change that you can make to better your experience and other people in your team and the company and the product and your users. So yeah.
I love that. I think my mom always used to say, you can bring a horse to water, you can't make it drink though. So let's talk a little bit about something that you've learned on your journey that you can really only gain through experience. You can't read a book for it. You can't interview a bunch of people. It's something you truly wish you had known before you embarked on trying to change the culture of your organization. Christine, since you brought an entire new strategy to LinkedIn, what's something that you learned on this journey that you think can only be gained through experience?
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest thing to make this successful, like, you know, any strategy or change that you do, you can't do it by yourself. You need to have people who are your allies, not just at your level and across, but also up. And I think what's really important is no matter what kind of organization you might be at, a startup, an academia, large tech company, right? It's important to understand those interpersonal organizational dynamics. Who has power? Who does not, right? Who has like the political clout? And, you know, it's understanding those relationship dynamics can really help you succeed in any change that you're trying to do. This could also be project related too, right? And part of it is building relationships. So if you know somebody is going to be difficult or might have pushback, trying to understand from their perspective too. Like, it's important to have those kind of conversations, foster a relationship, open that dialogue. Important thing too is that you're trying to facilitate change. Don't come guns a-blazing being like, I have every solution to your problems. I'm right, you're wrong, right? That's not a good way to have a conversation. It should be an open dialogue. You know, you want to hear their perspective, what matters to them. Share your perspective, what matters to you. Try to understand each other, right? And it might not even succeed in the first time. You have to be persistent too. I think that's a common thing. It's consistency over time that is going to help you get that change. And then once you kind of form those allies, particularly the ones that are in position of power who might be more challenging, once you have one of them, that's going to make your life so much easier because they can help champion that change, especially if you're not in a position of power. And that's kind of how you have to work the system. That's what I've discovered. And you don't learn this in school. You don't learn this from a textbook. It's all interpersonal dynamics through observation and kind of how people work together and understanding how organization structures work. And I think that's been the biggest learning that I've observed to make powerful change at a company like the size of LinkedIn.
I love that. I would never come guns blazing. with the right answer. Never, never. Very hard fought, hard won lessons. I think to play it back for everyone, it really is about knowing your allies, keeping it cross-functional. Your allies can come from anywhere, finding your champions, and remembering, I would say maybe, and see what you think, Christine, maybe to listen. And if you can listen, you can find out where someone else's problem overlaps with yours, and then create a winning value proposition that will get more people on your side. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially with certain topics like around diversity and inclusion can get very emotional and passionate. So sometimes, you know, you kind of have to, not to say discount your own emotions, but sometimes take a step back, take a breath, and kind of comprehend what might the situation be too, before you jump to conclusions. I think that is the most important part in trying to have an open dialogue with people who particularly might not agree with you on a particular point.
Fantastic. And Ying, when you think about some of the hard-won lessons that you've experienced over the past years, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I wanted to first like add on to what Christine mentioned about like finding
Definitely.
allies. I know when I joined my team, what I learned was building or creating an actual stakeholder map was very helpful for me to understand the context and the environment around me. Not only their, you know, of course, their name and their role, but like what drives them, what is the rationale behind their decisions, what are their priorities, what are their stressors, and it really builds that sense of empathy for my partners. It's really easy sometimes just from your side of the street to be like, oh, they're not able to implement this or they don't understand me, and it's easy to just default to that. But understanding that we're all human, we're all making these decisions with reasons and context behind them really drives that empathy and gives you that moment to pause. For me, it's building that culture of honesty has been definitely a trial process because, you know, we talk about honesty, but one of the things is of building that sense of transparency and honesty within the team and within the company is being open to giving and receiving feedback open-mindedly without any judgment or assumptions behind them. And that's hard because when you're giving I feel like I tended to not give feedback because I didn't want to hurt feelings, but feedback and criticism or like thoughts and beliefs, they should come from a sense of wanting to share knowledge, just context. And it's hard because then it's like you're opening yourself up as well for like feedback and criticism, and that can hurt. But it's all towards that overall goal of being honest with each other. It not only, you know, de-risks and makes us better collaborators, but it makes the team feel safe as well to share their inner thoughts and feelings.
I love that. And I think it reminds me that trust is, you know, most easily gained when it's given. And I think honesty really works the same way. If you show that you're going to be honest, you align your interest with somebody else's, and you show that nothing that you're sharing is malicious, it's truly based in their self-interest, it's really easy to make the conversation become a collaborative one where the both of you are working to solve a problem rather than the both of you sort of facing off against each other.
Yeah. Also, to add to that as well as like also the consistency of the practice as well. It's like if this is something that you make part of your ritual or daily habit, people really pick up on those behaviors as well.
Yeah. So just to reinforce that, both Christine and Ying, all about the consistency over time. Very hard to commit to, a lot like working out, shows the best results when you do it every day. All right, well, one thing that I'd love to do is sort of shift into the tactical. This is all great, and you know, we can be consistent for a number of years, but what's something that someone could start today? They can leave this talk, they can turn around to their organization, and they can make this one movement. Federico, what is something that someone who starts at Facebook tomorrow or next week can really think about in their job, and what's something tactical that they could do 6 months or 9 months into the role?
I love tactical stuff. I love to be practical. So yeah, thanks for the question. I think we can, it doesn't matter where we work. There's a few things that you can start tomorrow. So the first thing can be, why don't you start thinking about all your remote workforce? I mean, there will be people thinking about that. I mean, we're all designers here, more or less, or we know how design works, so we're all familiar with the idea of persona. Have we ever proactively thinking about remote persona? How will those people feel? Because some people will be now forever remote, right? And how can we make sure that they will always be included in the way that we work? We don't want to get like 2 years from now when someone will be, oh, I don't feel included. Like I feel like my manager loved this person because they're actually close in the office and I'm remote. We don't want to get that. So we have no excuses. We can start drafting and creating the experience for them to be like a peer experience to the people that will be in the office. So that can be one thing. And the other one will be, don't be afraid of like staying in your circle. When we say go cross-functional, and XFN is something that we say a lot of times, just really go XFN. Like start to include people in the meeting that have never really worked together, that I love to do. Whenever I put together people and I ask, have you guys ever worked together? And they say, I'm usually happy because it means that we're doing something different and probably we're being more inclusive. So these are the two advice I would like to share.
Fantastic. And Ying, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, for me, it would be the mantra of like questions are the answer. Just like go in guns blazing with questions of understanding what are the current processes of a team and what was the research or the data, the rationale that backed those processes. I think you start to get some really insightful understanding of like what were the intentions, what were the constraints, what were the realities, what's the current iterative process. Another thing is, definitely if you are in the position or just even asking about it, is making user research a core pillar of your overall design process, right? Like actually validating we're heading in the right direction, we're getting that validation and ideally having your team also be representative of your users as well as trying out and installing team processes or rituals that allow for more diverse thought and collaboration. And two of those things could be either silent or asynchronous design critiques. I think when we think of like design reviews or critiques, we think of like a lot of loud voices or like, I don't like that, or like, that sucks, you should change it that way. And it feels very intimidating. I was certainly intimidated when I was experiencing that for the first time in my career. And it wasn't until later on that I realized there's multiple ways that you can get valuable thought-provoking like feedback without having to just verbally communicate it. So it's also allowing for different forms of communication. Silent critiques is one of my favorite because it's like nobody talks and you all have the space to write down your feedback, and you only can write questions or compliments, not like, why did you do this instead of this, right? Or asynchronously, especially now that where a lot of us are working remote, is like we can't all get together at the same time or time zone to be able to review and provide feedback. So how can you set up that process so everyone can like access your designs easily, or your discussions easily, and be able to provide feedback? One of the things I started to do that I really enjoy is just do a video recording of what I'm working on and sharing them with my partners, just like, and it's weird because it's kind of like a Dear Diary of like, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm trying to tackle, this is what I would like your feedback on, and then just sharing a link to that with my partners.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think I've read a couple books and posts on how to survive a design critique. I think designers might be slightly braver than product managers in this case. It's a tough road out there sometimes. A lot of direct conflict, if you will.
Yeah. Oh, and to add to that too, it's like the reason why I feel so like intimidating and scary, not only because it's like loud, active voices, but it's like, I feel like a lot of us being empathetic designers, that we also, again, tie ourselves to our work. And that's, again, a process where you are always going to be more than your role and your work. You have multiple facets and identities to yourself. And it just takes practice to be like, I iterated on this. I know it's not going to be perfect, but I want to put something out there to get feedback on, and understand that feedback is they're just data points. They do not relate to me, my self-value, or anything, that who I truly am. So that's also, it's like separation from the feedback.
Yeah, and I think that same thing applies when you work in diversity and inclusion. It is so important to be both empathetic and emotionally connected to the topic, and also to find space from how it actually gets applied. The consistency that you're hearing from Christine and from Ying, these are required because change is very difficult. And we have seen a huge burst of change in the last 5 or 10 years, which has been fantastic, whether it's around our conception of gender or our conception of work or our conception of the role of, law enforcement. Conversation has drastically changed, but it often takes a huge buildup of effort up until that point. The other thing that I would love to share with everyone is there's so much to learn from social science in this effort. When we study race, and a lifetime ago, I was a political scientist. So when we study race and when we study gender disparities, we really focus on metrics. And so much of metrics can, be this massive data set that you have to go out and collect, but so much of it can also be simply looking around the room. Who's not there? Who hasn't had a chance to be at the table? Who aren't you hearing, and why? Who's responsible for getting the coffee, and who's responsible for taking notes. These are all old tropes by now, but they're still very visible at work. So one thing I would love to do as we think about moving forward is just ask, what advice would you give your younger self? If you're just starting out and you're thinking about your first job, your second job, everyone here on the panel has been working for some time. They've worked at a couple of locations and really built a career. But for those of us who are still earlier in tenure, what is advice that you'd love to give your younger self? And Anna, if we could start with you, I'd love to hear it.
Sure. I'd say one of the biggest learnings I've had in my career was to be careful who I take advice from. There's a lot of opinions that people have about your work, about what you do, about how you do things. And it's really important to make sure that whatever criticism you get is constructive criticism, and that you can take action points from there to make you better. And also have good judgment in terms of, thinking, yeah, this is good advice. This is something that I can implement. Or if this is something that I can't, that's also fine. And also something that I found really valuable was to make sure that I take learnings from every single experience, good or bad, it doesn't really matter. It's just in terms of, okay, so I've gone through this product build, I've worked with this team, I worked at this company, we developed something together. What is it that I can learn that will help me make my approach better for, my next product or the next team I work with? And I think that sort of investment really compounds over time and makes you a better person, makes you a better designer, and also allows you to create a connection that's based on vulnerability and honesty. Because just going back quickly to the point that we were discussing earlier, I think why we all get so nervous around design critiques is the fear of judgment. And one thing that we need to keep in mind is design is all about asking why all the time. And asking why is questioning our beliefs, our bias, our reality, and that is the job. So I think that shared vulnerability is actually a strength rather than a weakness, and it should be celebrated. No fear.
No fear. Is that your advice to your younger self? Jump in.
Absolutely. Just keep moving forward, whatever happens.
Fantastic. And Christine, what do you think?
Yeah, for me, it's probably two things. The first one is don't wait for somebody else to be the change, right? Like if you see something, say something, right? It's like the same thing when you're on the subways and you see those, if you see a bomb, say something, don't wait, right? But I think in all seriousness, it's more of especially coming as an Asian American, it feels like a very Western ideal to be vocal, be extroverted, and that can be very intimidating for some folks. But I think the important thing about what I'm trying to give the advice to is you don't have to do it in an extroverted way. You can still be subtle and do things in a private manner that can still be helping and influencing the change that you want. Just figure out what your strengths are. And if something doesn't sit right with you, don't be afraid to say something. There's probably somebody else in the room who's feeling the exact same thing as you. So it helps, again, to find those allies and to like really champion that change. Otherwise, it's never going to happen. The second thing that I would say is don't be afraid to ask. I think being, younger, coming straight from school, I remember my first job in consulting, I was always intimidated to ask questions or say no to a project, or like, even with my offer, like negotiating more for it, because I would think like, oh, if I ask for these things, people are going to think that I'm like, just demanding a lot more or like entitled. So I'm not going to say anything. But what I've learned is that most of the time, that's not actually what people think. Your answer is always going to be no if you don't ask. It's more about how you frame the question, how you ask for it in a way that can, still help you get to the position that you want. So I think one thing is like kind of try to get over some of your fears and like ask for the things that you need to be successful, whether it's in your career, in your personal life. Otherwise, you can't be that change that you would want to.
I love that. And, for everyone who's a little bit earlier in their career, or for everyone who's starting a new job, these moments are moments that are, as Anna pointed out, free of judgment, actually. You can ask as many questions as you want, and I would totally take advantage of that. Continuously ask, make sure that you understand in a very non-judgmental, neutral way, so that you have a base to actually start to build your argument and your idea of what things should look like. Ying, what would you say?
Yeah, definitely being comfortable with being wrong, which is hard because again, it leaves you in a very vulnerable state. And I really resonate with that because for me, like growing up in a family where like academia was like the holy grail, right? And it's either you get an A or an A. It's a very binary type of foundation to then go from there. And then when you're in the workforce, I had to deal with this fear of like being wrong or being perceived as wrong, especially as a woman, of like, oh, I have to make sure I have my shit together or else I'll be perceived as like not worthy of my peers. But that's something I've had to just unlearn, and being comfortable with like, especially a lot of times we're not working in ideal, we're working in reality where you only have some of the information, like, so being comfortable with only knowing like 75%, being comfortable with that, and then like actioning on that and knowing that you have the opportunity to iterate. And then the other thing is owning your narrative. Especially early in my career, I was very quiet, very shy, did not speak up. And what happened is like that vacuum, that space was taken up by my team or my manager that would just assume what I was working on and the rationale behind it and what my status updates were. So that's also something of a muscle that I've had to learn, is just owning my narrative, being proactive about like, this is where I'm coming from, this is where I'm tackling, this is the level of effort, and this is why I feel this is important to do right now. And I may be wrong, but I want to at least make it known that this is what I'm trying to track towards, or else someone else is going to speak for you.
I love that. So if you were to think, let's pursue that for a second further. I would call this out as kind of a pro move. So if you were able to adopt this, asking questions is fantastic. Doing some of the things that everyone has mentioned is fantastic, but owning your narrative and identifying the areas where you want to focus on your own development, I would argue is a pretty pro move to adopt early in your career. Ying, what's an example of something like that you've done either recently or early on?
Yeah, one thing is when I join a new team, or like when I see new people join my team, is that I try to give like daily or weekly status updates to my leader or to my manager, right? And it's something that that it's a good practice of like being accountable for what you're doing. And again, like the rationale, the reasoning behind it. What are your blockers? What are your drivers that you're working toward? And it essentially makes everyone's jobs easier, because when it's one of those things that you learn about like managing up is when you own your own narrative and you're able to share like, this is what I'm working on, this is what's blocking me, this is what I'm going to tackle next, then your team and your leaders know And they won't assume, they won't, answer for you or assume for you. But yeah, it's like, and it makes your jobs easier too, because like status updates, like team status updates are things that managers, leaders have to account for, like what my team is doing, how it's tracking toward the company goals. So that not only, makes them look good, it makes you look good, it also keeps you accountable to the goals that you personally have for yourself. When it's like a frequent, consistent practice of documenting however you decide to do it someplace, so you can always look back and say like, I know I'm growing towards my goals because I have it all here. I can see it.
That's fantastic. And, for example, starting at McKinsey and Company wasn't my first job, but it's the first time I took a structured approach. So I actually have a document where I write the things I did and that I worked on every week. And that helps me understand where I've been successful and where I could spend some more time. Federico, when you think about your career early on, where would you advise someone who's just starting out? Where should they spend some of their time? What are skills or tips that they could bring on early in their career?
I would just say don't over-index on your craft, especially if you're a designer, and just really pay attention to those that are called the soft skills, and being able to work with ambiguity, being sure that you definitely deliver quality, but make sure that you can bring new perspective and you know how to deal with like cross-functional stakeholders and people that you've never met before, because those are the things that will make you a great teammate first, and then probably even a better manager. So whether you're going like upwards or downwards, it doesn't matter. If you're always trying to be a communicator on top of being a maker, I guess you'll be much more successful.
Fantastic. Love all of the knowledge all of you have shared. Moving to something supremely tactical. Let's say, and this question is from one of our audience members on Luma. Let's say that you were to actually apply for a job and you were going to deal with discrimination, either in your job interview or in your resume selection. We have a host of folks up here, and I am sure, Ying has probably faced some of this. I have definitely faced it. When you have a resume and it has a supremely identifiable name, you do deal with some resume bias, some name selection bias. What is some advice that you would give to someone who believes that they're facing resume selection bias or is finding discrimination in the interview process? And what are some ways that you would identify that kind of bias during the process? Let me keep this open. Let's see which one of our panelists can speak to this.
Yeah, I can chime in first. For me, I would recommend asking about the interview process itself and understand like, hey, can you walk me through, not only what are the meetings that are scheduled, but like who is involved, what are the process or the metrics of that interview process, and then also ask like, are there any steps in place to minimize biases in the interview process? And that also communicates like, hey, it's like one of those things that's like important to me. And if you're hiring for diversity, that's kind of the key things that I'm looking toward.
I'd like to add something on this. It's a bit of a tricky question because obviously if you're interviewing for a job, it means that someone identified your skill set as adequate for the role. So that's a great victory. If you were to feel discrimination throughout the process, and that would probably mean that it's not the right company for you. And it's a massive red flag if you can identify it, at interview level, and a blessing in disguise, I'd say. There's a really good clip of Brené Brown where she talks about the difference between fitting in and belonging. There's a lot of talk in job descriptions and companies about, oh, this person needs to fit in culturally, or they need to fit in within the dynamic. And fitting in really sometimes can mean you stripping away your own person to fit in somewhere that doesn't accept you as you are and the value that you can bring to the team and the company and the product and the users. And belonging is, when it's a match, you can tell it's a match, and discrimination will never come up in the sort of in the process. And I would definitely say always trust your gut feeling, because that's just things that you observe that you're not able to verbalize yet, but gut feelings never lie.
This is great. Yeah, I would say, you know, as someone who's faced discrimination in the interview process and probably bias in the resume selection process, it is important to remember that you are also interviewing them. We are not in this particular moment in a job scarcity market. We are in the opposite. There are a ton of roles, people are switching jobs, and there's a strong, strong desire to find more qualified talent. More and more traditional or incumbent industries are thinking about how they properly grow and adopt software into their organizations, and design is an enormous part of that, as is product development and QA. I would urge all of you to find a place where you feel like you have, I would say, at least 90% support. If you have one person that you interview with that you feel like is biased, and you're going to be working with that person most of the time, you are not setting yourself up for a really good 9 to 5. And I would lean on what Ying identified earlier and what Anna talked about earlier. You're a person too, not just a designer, not just a product manager, not just someone who does QA or development. So please do keep your eyes out. Always reach out to folks on ADP List if you have a question, or in Design Buddies if you have a question. And outside of that, I want to thank every single one of our panelists who has joined here, all of the attendees who came, and all of the questions that you guys have provided on Luma and elsewhere. We look forward to this being just one of a number of conversations, and keeping up both that consistency and that continuous persistence. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. And thanks to all of our panelists again.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was amazing. We're gonna do our group photo now. So I'll say a couple of things as I wait for everyone to turn their camera. I'm going to unpin all of our speakers so we can see all of our buddies here. But thank you so much, Maggie from Design Buddies, for helping us out moderate our event as well. And everyone, all of our panelists and ADP lists, and all of our hosts as well tonight. For amazing work. And if anything, any of our speakers said resonated with y'all, or if you learned something new, definitely would really love to see y'all post on socials and tag everyone too. And I'm going to count down a few seconds for everyone to turn their camera. We're going to do a static photo first, and then a wave for our Instagram story. All right, 10, 9, 8. Oh, feel free to share takeaways in the chat as well. Let us know like what really resonated with you. We really want to know what y'all took away from this wonderful event. Definitely like to echo, interviews are a two-way street. I feel like for me, really new in my career, with my peers, really new in my career as well. It's always like really intimidating. Like, if oftentimes how I feel, what other people feels is like you want to get the first job you get, and without kind of treating the interview like a two-way street. But when you're interviewing someone, you're also interviewing them as well. Cool, I'm just checking the chat. But yeah, all right, 10. Feel free to bring your stuffed animal if you want to be in a group photo as well. 10, oh, I love the Totoro. 9, 8, I'm gonna be a Pikachu this time. 8, 7, 6, 5, oh my God, it's a dog. I see a product splash background. Cool. 10, 9, 8, 7. We're gonna do multiple pages, so just hold smiling, say Fluffles. Almost our mascot. It's a little bunny right here. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Smile. Okay, do multiple pages. All right, keep smiling. Say Fluffle. I can't hear anyone but Fluffle. All right, last page. Oh, right, last page. Cool. Now we're gonna do a wave for Instagram story. So feel free to like dance, dab, do whatever you want. This is gonna be recorded on our stories on design.buddies. We're gonna tag ADP List so they can reshare as well. Make sure you follow both of us, tag us in your stories. All right, ready, set, Let me make sure I get my window in the view. Too many windows open. All right, ready, set, wave. Hello, buddies. We are at Creating Inclusive Culture in Design with ADP List. Thank you all so much for coming. Oh my God, the doggo. Yeah, thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.
Bye.
Bye. I love your doggo, Alistair. But yeah, that concludes our event. Make sure to follow Design Buddies, and we also will send out the recording afterwards as well. Just drop the link in the chat in case y'all missed any part of it, but it is recorded, so you're welcome to go back if you missed the beginning. With that, we're going to do a quick post-event sync with our lovely hosts and panelists. I'm going to open a breakout room, but this concludes our event. Definitely continue the conversation on Discord or on ADP List Slack, and I'm going to stop live streaming to YouTube. So bye, YouTube. Bye.